Hello and welcome back to the Tik-A Tee Method. My name is Ron Castingway, longtime educator, composer, author, conductor, clinician, and performer. I'm so glad you're joining me here for week 13 as we dive into dotted rests. For the past few videos, we've talked a lot about dotted notes. Well, can you add an augmentation dot to a rest? Yes, you can. And we're going to be adding dots to half rests, to quarter rests, and to eighth rests in this video. So I hope you'll stick around for the whole video, do some exercises with me. Let's add dotted rests to our musical vocabulary right now. All right, here we are at week 13, and you can see at the top of the page, we have our 3 new dotted rests. Our dotted half rest, our dotted quarter rest, and our dotted eighth rest. We're also going to be adding in a new rest for us, a 16th rest. And we'll talk about that in the math behind the dotted eighth rest and how we're going to now incorporate 16th rests into our vocabulary. But we'll get to that in a second. First, I want to remind us of the definition of what an augmentation dot does when it's placed to the right-hand side, in this case, of a rest. So let's look at this definition. It says, when a dot is added to the right of a rest, the value of the rest increases by half the rest's original value. So the definition of a dot or an augmentation dot when it's placed to the right-hand side of a note head or the right-hand side of a rest doesn't change. The difference is this, and it's pretty logical and self-explanatory. When a dot's placed to the right-hand side of a note head, it extends the value of the tone production, of the sound, of the value of the note. So we're getting a longer sound. Well, when it's placed to the right-hand side of a rest, we're extending the silence. And that's the main difference between dotted notes and dotted rests. I know that's probably pretty logical and makes a lot of sense, but it's important for us to wrap our heads around this conceptually before we dive into the math of each one of these rests. All right, let's start with the dotted half rest here in the center. Now, I want us to remember throughout this video the note equivalent to each one of these dotted rests. In other words, a dotted half rest is equivalent to or equal to a dotted half note. And since we've already learned the dotted half note, we can now understand that a dotted half rest is the same exact thing, except it is silence. So it gets 3 beats of silence instead of 3 beats of sound. And if you look at the math here, we've got a half rest plus a quarter rest. Now, a half rest gets 2 beats. Half of 2 is 1, and that is a quarter rest, which gets 1 beat. When we add the half rest plus the quarter rest, we get 3 beats of silence. So that's the math behind a dotted half rest, and the note equivalent to a dotted half rest is the dotted half note. Let's now move on to the dotted quarter rest right here, and I'll circle that one in green. The note equivalent to a dotted quarter rest, of course, is a dotted quarter note. And we know from previous videos that a dotted quarter note is 1.5 beats long. Well, guess what? A dotted quarter rest is also 1.5 beats long. The difference being sound versus silence. So 1.5 beats. And how do we get that math? Well, we take a quarter rest, which is 1 beat in common time. We add to that half of a quarter rest, which is an eighth rest, a half of a beat. And we combine those two together to get 1.5 beats. So we have 1.5 beats of silence for a dotted quarter rest versus 1.5 beats of sound for a dotted quarter note. Let's now turn our attention to the dotted eighth rest. Now, the note equivalent for a dotted eighth rest is, of course, a dotted eighth note. And we know from previous videos, in common time, that gets 3/4 of a beat. Now, just like with the dotted eighth note, when we're counting a dotted eighth rest, I don't want us to count 3/4 of a beat of silence. We're going to talk about this and how to conceptualize it holistically in a full beat in common time in a moment. But first, let's talk about the math. So behind the dotted eighth note, we had an eighth note plus a 16th note. So we have the original value, which is the 8th note. Half of that value, which is a 16th note, a half of an 8th note is a 16th note, and we combine them together. So we're adding an 8th note plus a 16th note. Well, with our dotted 8th rest, it is exactly the same except they're rests. We have the 8th rest right here, which I just boxed, and our brand new rest for week 13, the 16th rest right here, which is basically, I'll draw one beneath here, is an 8th rest plus a tiny 8th rest superimposed on top of it. So it looks like two 8th rests combined. The smaller one is on the bottom, and that's basically what a 16th rest looks like right here. So a 16th rest is equivalent to a 16th note. An 8th rest is equivalent to an 8th note. So the math behind our dotted 8th note getting 3/4 of a beat is exactly the same math behind our dotted 8th rest, which gets 3/4 of a beat. Again, the difference being sound versus silence. And at the bottom of the page, right here, I'm just going a little further in depth about our new rest, the 16th rest. And as you can see, I'm showing the rest and note equivalencies here. So we have our 16th rest and our 16th note. We have our 8th rest and our 8th note, and we have our quarter rest and our quarter note. Now, the reason that I introduced the 16th rest here in week 13 is because we needed it in order to understand the math behind our dotted 8th rest. Little side note, there will be no 16th rests in any of the exercises for week 13. That'll be coming in future rhythmic motifs, soon to come. The only reason I introduced the 16th rest here is so that we could understand the math behind that dotted 8th rest. And on the bottom right-hand side of the page right here, I'm discussing how we should be thinking about the dotted 8th rest. 9 times out of 10 in common time, when you see a dotted 8th rest appear, it will be followed by a 16th note, a flagged 16th note that will close off the entire beat. Let's for a moment think back to week 11. We had a 1-beat rhythmic motif of a dotted 8th note going to a 16th note. If it happened 4 times on a common time measure, here's what it sounded like. 3, 4. Tia, 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 tia. So again, 9 times out of 10, when you see a dotted 8th note appear in common time, it's going to be followed by a 16th note. The same thing applies to a dotted 8th rest. A 16th note will close off that beat more often than not. And we're going to notice that in our exercises here in week 13. We're going to be thinking now about that dotted 8th rest and that flag 16th note as a 1-beat pattern and the 16th note as a pickup into the next beat. I'll talk more about that as we get into the exercises. Let's go right now. And here we are at exercise 13D. Now, just like last week, I'm not automatically going to the first 2 exercises in week 13 because I want to make sure that the exercises I choose for today's video include all 3 of our dotted rests. So we're going to have exercises that include the dotted half rest, the dotted quarter rest, and the dotted 8th rest. I've also brought back my Boss DB90 as our metronome for today's video when we perform. Okay, so let's dive into the analysis for exercise 13D. And right in the first measure of exercise 13D on beat 1, we have the arrival of our dotted half rest, which we know takes up 3 beats. So I'm going to write 1, 2, 3 above that rest. On beat 4, we have 2 8th notes, T, T. In our second measure, we've got our second dotted rest for week 13, the dotted quarter rest, which we know the note equivalent is the dotted quarter note, and we know both get 1.5 beats. So over that dotted quarter rest, I can write 1 over the rest. This dot can designate beat 2, and then this 8th note will be the upbeat of beat 2. Now, I can incorporate invisible bar line in this measure, which goes right here before this quarter note on beat 3. And then to close off this measure, we've got a dotted eighth rest arriving on beat 4. And as I just mentioned before we started the analysis of this exercise, I want us to think about our dotted eighth rest more holistically, meaning let's include that flag 16th note into that beat. So as we're thinking about this 16th note right here, the last 16th note in Tik-A, we want to be thinking about that as a pickup into the very next measure, instead of counting 3/4 of a beat on beat 4. In other words, it will sound like this: 3, 4, a-tee, tee, a-tee, tee. So that's what it's going to sound like going into that third measure on these two T-Ts here on the downbeat of the third measure. Then we have Tik-A, Tik-A, and then we have a reverse dotted rhythm from last week. We have this eighth note coming in on 3 and this dotted quarter note coming on the upbeat of beat 3, and we're going to hold that full value all the way to the downbeat of the fourth measure, where we have the arrival of another dotted half rest, which we know gets 3 beats. Now, we can look ahead because we know that Tik-A, Tik-A is going to take up beat 4, and we can be looking ahead as we're saying Tik-A, Tik-A to what's coming up in measure 5. And in measure 5, the first measure on the second line, we start off with 2 16th notes taking up a half a beat. If we look at all of beat 1, it would include that eighth rest there. So 2 16th notes plus an eighth rest is all of beat 1. Beat 2, we've got a dotted eighth rest coming in. If we look at all of beat 2, it includes that flagged 16th note. And the way that I want us to be thinking about the dotted eighth rest to the 16th note is that the 16th note, Tik-A, Tik-A, the very last part of this beat is a pickup into whatever's coming next. And in this case, it's a half note on beats 3 and 4. So let me demonstrate what measure 5 going into measure 6 would sound like. It would sound like this: 3, 4, Tik-A, a-ta, Tik-A. I'll do that again. 3, 4, Tik-A, a-ta, Tik-A. So hopefully when you hear this rhythm, it makes a little bit more sense to you, and how we're thinking of that dotted eighth rest to that 16th note being a pickup into whatever's coming next. Let's move on to measure 6. We start off measure 6 the same way we started measure 5, with 2 16th notes on beat 1. And we look at all of beat 1 by including that eighth rest. Beat 2 is a quarter rest. Beat 3, we've got a dotted quarter rest. So we can think of the rest as beat 3, and the dot can be designated as beat 4. And these 2 16th notes will come in on the upbeat of beat 4. Moving on to measure 7, we have Tik-A Tee. Then we've got an eighth rest on beat 2 with an upbeat flagged eighth note on the upbeat of 2. Then we have an eighth rest on beat 3 with 2 16th notes on the upbeat of beat 3, and a quarter note on beat 4. Now, if I was to go back and insert some invisible bar lines, let's do that. Let's do that for measure, let's go to measure 6. So in between these two rests right here, we'd have an invisible bar line. It's really good for us to compartmentalize these measures in half. Measure 7, where would this go? It would go right in here before beat 3. So we can see the first half of that 4/4 measure and the second half. Let's move on to measure 8. We have a quarter note on the downbeat of 1. Then we have this little pattern right here, our dotted eighth rest to 16th note, to that flag 16th note. And I want us to think about this as one full beat, and that 16th note as a pickup, and the last part of the Tik-A, Tik-A pattern going into whatever's coming next. And again, we have a half note here on beats 3 and 4. And that dotted eighth rest is beat 2. So measure 8 will sound like this: 3, 4, ta, a ta. And I hold that out full value. I would tell my students to write -1. I'll do that again: 3, 4, ta, a ta. And then we release and hold that half note full value. So hopefully this analysis helps you. If you need to pause the video at any time to insert more of the invisible bar lines or write in the Tik-A Tee verbiage, please do so. Feel free to stop the video and then just restart it when you're ready to go. But we are going to now perform exercise 13D with a metronome. All right, the first thing that I want to do is remove all of this ink so you can see the exercise more clearly. Now, if you need to pause the video so you can analyze the exercise further, or maybe write in the Tik-A Tee verbiage since it's not included in this exercise, by all means, stop the video now and then come back and join me when you are ready. But I'm going to get started here by getting our Boss DB90 kicking. We're at 74 beats per minute, or the quarter note equals 74. I will be singing this on a G3. You are welcome to join me on this same pitch in unison, or an octave below, an octave higher, or a different note altogether. But I hope you'll vocalize the rhythms for exercise 13D with me right now. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and T, 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 ta. A T, T, Tik-A, Tik-A, Tee, ta. Tik-A, 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 a ta, Tik-A. Tik-A, Tik-A, Tee, Tee, Tik-A, ta, ta, a ta. All right. Stop the metronome. Turn the metronome down a little bit. There you have it. Okay, so that was exercise 13D with a metronome at 74 BPM, or 74 beats per minute. I hope you joined me. Now, because of some of the challenges here, especially that dotted 8th rest to that flag 16th note, that is a brand new concept to be thinking about a beat as a pickup into whatever's coming next. We need to go check our rhythms against the MP3 for accuracy. So let's go find the MP3 for 13D right now. All right, here we are at my website where you can find all 363 of the MP3s that accompany my book. We, of course, are looking at week 13, exercise D here. We're going to listen to this MP3. Now, we know from previous videos you have 3 options. Option number 1, just listen to the MP3 and check for your accuracy that way. Option 2, sing along, vocalize the rhythm with the MP3. Or option 3, especially if your principal instrument is not the voice, break out your instrument and perform along with the MP3. So without further ado, I'm going to press play on the MP3 for exercise 13D. One, 2, 3, 4. T, 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 ta, a T, T, Tik-A, Tik-A, Tee, ta. Tik-A, 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 a ta, Tik-A. Tik-A, Tik-A, Tee, Tee, Tik-A, ta, ta, a ta. And there you have it, exercise 13D. So, if you did not play this on your instrument yet, now is the time to do it before you move on to the next exercise or the next concept. And speaking of performances, here is a performance of exercise 13D. One, 2, 3, 4. All right, let's move right on to the next exercise, 13E, and start the analysis. In the very first beat, we have the dotted quarter rest, which we know is 1.5 beats. And the way we can think about this rest is the same way we think about the dotted quarter note, with the quarter rest being beat 1, and that this dot we can think of as beat 2, and then this 8th note comes in on the upbeat of beat 2. We can then incorporate our invisible bar line right here and follow it up with beats 3 and 4 on these 2 quarter notes. In the next measure, we have week 6 right here, that dotted quarter note to the 8th note where we have beats 1 and 2 taken care of right there. Our invisible bar line will split these two phrases in the middle, and we have the reverse of that from last week's video, the reverse dotted rhythm, the 8th note to the dotted quarter note. But that's also 2 beats, and that takes up beats 3 and 4. That'll create 8th note syncopation on that dotted quarter note. If you haven't checked out week 12's video, now's the time to go check that out. Moving on to measure 3, we've got a quarter note on beat 1. We can hold that full value all the way to beat 2. Then on beat 2, we have a half rest with a dot on it. So we have a dotted half rest. And we don't need to incorporate the invisible bar line into this analysis because that's a pretty straightforward measure to compartmentalize. Moving on to measure 4, the last measure in the first line, we've got a dotted quarter rest. There it is. So that's beat 1. The dot is beat 2. This 8th note is the upbeat of beat 2. And we have a invisible bar line right here, followed by beats 3 and 4 on those 2 quarter notes. And since 3 and 4 is pretty easy, pretty simple, we definitely could be looking ahead to measure 5 on the next line and getting ready for what's coming up next. And in measure 5, or the first measure on the second line, we have one of our 2-beat reverse dotted rhythms from last week's video. 2 16th notes going to a dotted quarter note. We know it creates 8th note syncopation, and we know it's 2 beats long. These 2 16th notes come in on beat 1. This dotted quarter note comes in on the upbeat of beat 1 and lasts for 1.5 beats. Our invisible bar line in measure 5 will go right here. The second half of measure 5, we have week 9's pattern, the dotted quarter note to 2 16th notes. This comes in on beat 3. We can think of this dot as beat 4, and these 2 16th notes would come in on the upbeat of beat 4. So if you look at measure 5, you can see that these 2-beat musical sight words are just inversions of each other. Musicians will pick up on this right away and understand what they sound like. That's the goal. We want to get to that point in our rhythmic sight reading. Moving on to measure 6, we have 2 quarter notes on 1 and 2. Then we have an invisible bar line right here, followed by a quarter rest on beat 3. Now, on beat 4, we have our dotted 8th rest to that flag 16th note. And the way we're going to be thinking about that flag 16th note, it's the last part of our Tik-A Tee series, and we're going to be picking up into that next measure. So that 16th note is just going to be a pickup into the Tik-A Tee on beat 1 of measure 7. Going into beat 2, we have TT here, followed by an invisible bar line. Then we have a dotted quarter rest on beat 3. We can think of that dot right there as beat 4, and then this flagged 8th note, the upbeat of beat 4. The last measure, really simple. We have a dotted half note on 1, 2, and 3. We're going to hold that out all the way to beat 4, where we have this quarter rest on beat 4. And I would tell my students to write -4 there, so we hold that dotted half note out full value. So now we've analyzed it. But again, if you need to analyze this exercise further before performing it with a metronome, you can pause the video right now. You can analyze it more, you can write in the Tik-A Tee verbiage, whatever it takes to get you ready to perform it with a metronome. When you're ready, come back and join me. We're going to go perform it right now. All right, let's dive in by first removing all the ink on this page so you can see the exercise a lot more clearly. We're going to stay at 74 beats per minute. There you have it on the Boss DB90. And here we go with our G3. This is what I'll be singing this exercise on, but I hope that you'll join me and vocalize the rhythms for exercise 13E. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and T-ta, ta, ta, T-T, ta, ta. T-ta, ta, Tik-A ta, ta, Tik-A ta, ta. A Tik-A, Tik-A, Tee, Tee, T-ta. All right. Stop the metronome. We've now performed this with a metronome. We need to go to the MP3 next to check for our accuracy, so let's not waste any time. Let's go find the MP3 for 13E right now. And here we are back at my website where you can find all the MP3s. We, of course, are looking at exercise 13E here. I know you know what the three options are, so I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to press play on the MP3 for 13E right now. One, two, three, four. Ti ta ta ta, ti ti ta ta, ti ta ta, Tik-A ta ta, Tik-A ta ta, a Tik-A Tee tee, ti ta. All right, there's exercise 13E, and you know that if you have not yet performed this exercise on your instrument, especially if your instrument isn't primarily the voice, now is the time to do that before you move on to the next rhythm or the next concept. Okay, now, before we head to the outro, here is a fun performance of exercise 13E. One, two, three, four. All right, that does it for week 13. Thank you so much for joining me. We've added 4 new concepts to our rhythmic vocabulary this week. We've added the dotted half rest, we've added the dotted quarter rest, and we've added the dotted eighth rest. And in order to understand the math behind that dotted eighth rest, I had to introduce to you the 16th rest. And looking forward to weeks 14 and 15, we're going to be incorporating that 16th rest into some really fun 16th note rhythmic motifs. So I'm really looking forward to those videos, and I hope you'll join me. I also hope that you'll check out my book, Rhythmic Sight-Reading, the Tik-A Tee Method. It's available at roncastingway.com. It's also available on Amazon and at jwpepper.com. And don't forget to check out my store, Ron Castingway Music. A lot of great resources there for professional musicians, music educators, and music students alike. And if you would be so kind to help out the channel, please hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that notification bell. And leave a comment if you're inspired to do so. I will reply to all comments. Thank you again for joining me here for week 13. I look forward to seeing you in week 14.